get knocked down, I get back up and fight!
You minions are a joke. You think you lead even a scratch on Her Majesty the Queen?
Shut up! I'm gonna win! I have good friends here in this world. We love Vanguard and we play whenever we get the chance. There's no way I'd give up all that. I'm not done yet. Add 5,000 to the shield using the skill. Infinite Slash Rush!
Unbelievable! All Kamui Katsuraga's units are standing!
Oh, I'm just getting started.
Victor is one of my favorite decks, and I've been playing it since release, which at this point is longer than I'm comfortable with thinking about. There are a lot of different ways to build Victor, just because Victor has so many good options open to it that it can be very tricky to try and narrow them down. And really, it all kind of depends on what you're building the deck to focus on, which goes back, honestly, back into the days of late G and early premium, when a lot of the builds were focused on winning champ Victor, which focused on getting as many restands as possible to soul blast out everything, give those things power, flip up a lot of cards in your G zone, and then probably win on that turn alone, and if not, you had every possibility of going into your GB8 the next turn. With Premium Collection 2019, we got Universe Ace Bustard, and the build didn't change too much, still had a lot of the same focus, just because both Bustard and Winning Champ had the same cost. So it made going from one or the other very, very easy. Things wouldn't really change too much until we got Asdabulk in 2020, which for some reason was a card that was kind of derided somewhat on release for some reason. I'm not sure why restanding your front row in Nova Groppler is considered a bad thing, but when you built to go into Asdabulk specifically, you could get some very, very potent aggro results. Things would stay largely the same until we got Merciless Dragon, the card that I was so fortunate enough to bring to you all and reveal to you. And similar to Asdabulk, I feel like when this card was first revealed, people were kind of downplaying it a little bit, but once people got to play around with it, they realized how strong the card could be. And now this has all happened again, that we've gotten the History Collection errated strides, and this is the main thing that this Victor build is focusing on going first and getting that superior stride to have as potent of a Vic 10 turn as possible. Let's go ahead and get into the list, and starting off, we have 4 copies of the original G-era Extreme Battler Victor. Now, you could totally make room or swap some numbers around to make room for the V Victor. This is still a very good card. However, because this list is focused on Vic 10 and having as potent a Vic 10 turn as possible, I've opted to go for only the G Victor to as not risk riding the wrong card. The most important thing about this card is its name, but being able to have the on-stride skill to have an extra restand is always welcome, and honestly that GB2 has come up more often than I would have expected when I was first working on this list. The other grade 3 we're running is 2 copies of Ultimate Lifeform Cosmolord. I would like to run more of this, but you run too many and you risk it getting very cloggy, just because in order to use his restanding skill, you do have to rest 2 rearguards in the main phase, and we don't always have ways of getting them standing back up and we start losing out on attacks that turn. That being said, there are some scenarios with this build where you can swing with him 3 times at full power. Not riding Victor is one of the fail cons of this deck, so if you're playing this and you decide that you don't want to run Cosmolord, it doesn't bring the use that you want, you can totally find room for something like Zubat Battler Victor. Zubat Battler Victor is still an amazing card, still does really well, and you'll still see it pop up in a lot of people's Victors lists, but I almost think you would be just as good, if not better off, perhaps even running the old Excessive Battler Victor, because worst case scenario, if you do have to ride this, you can just normal hard stride into Vic 10 and have a completely damageless restand turn, because with some of the cards we have in this deck, you're able to create 2 front row restands with this, and that's not necessarily anything to scoff at. But that being said, I am still opting for the Cosmolord just because I feel like it raises the ceiling a little bit more. On into our grade 2s, I am somewhat controversially only running 2 copies of Extreme Battler Golshachi. Golshachi is still an amazing card, and don't let me downplaying it somewhat here by running so few copies deter you. If you want to run more copies of this, you can absolutely go on ahead with that. It's still an amazing card. The main reason I'm not valuing it as much in this particular build is that he has a pretty big glaring weakness in costing a counterblast to use his skill, and with the way this deck is designed and built and what it is meant to go into, we don't always have the extra counterblast to spare in that case. Golshachi does have 2 additional things that really make him valuable for this list still, and that's his GB2 to be able to become his own booster when he restands, and naturally having resist. That can be very, very important in certain matchups, and is probably one of the main reasons to focus on adding more copies of this into your deck, but for right now, 2 copies is working just fine for me. Next, we have 3 copies of Bare Knuckle Arnest. This card serves 2 purposes in this deck, and the main one is drawing us a card. The other reason we run him is because of his skill to restand something that he likely rested himself, or maybe we rested with Cosmolord. This is mainly here just because it lets us get our rush skills started in the main phase before we've even conducted our first battle. So we're able to kind of build up some of those skills before we even start swinging, just to make the ceiling go even higher. This is the one card that I am probably not the most 100% on. I feel really good with this, but if there's one thing I would swap this instead, it would be Sazanda, because yes, there's actually no copies of Sazanda in this build, just because I don't think Sazanda does as well for us in this build as what we're running instead. For now, I do think Arnest is working just fine. I'm liking Arnest a lot, but just know that if you really want to try and make room for Sazanda somewhere in this list, I think this is the spot to make room for. Next, we have the best and probably my favorite grade 2 in the deck, and that's Cool Hank. Cool Hank is just very, very solid, very, very good ride target, because when he hits, he lets us draw a card, and drawing cards is always welcome in this deck, and his basically costless restand ability. This is the one grade 2 I'm running at max copies because it's the one grade 2 in the deck that I am almost always happy to see at any point in the game. Lastly, for our grade 2s, we're running 3 copies of Spiral Breaker. Spiral Breaker being a Soul Blast to restand potentially an entire column is really, really good, but we're only running 3 because if you don't want to see more than 2 at one time in the game, because the second these start having to hit our Excel markers, they become completely useless. So don't be afraid at all to use any excess copies of this to use its top deck search ability before we get to grade 2, because we do kind of have some text in the grade 1 lineup, and if we need to search for them, this is a fine way to try and get to those if it absolutely calls for it. There are other options you could run in grade 2s as well, other than Sazanda. You could also make room for Brutal Jack. There's actually a really fun kind of interaction you can do where you can have a strong grade 1 rush turn by having Brutal Jack, Spiral Breaker, and Cool Hank. You can have a 5 attack turn that way, which is pretty cool. But you might also decide you want to make room for Ninjad. Ninjad is another restander, is restricted to Victor in name, but can also potentially turn whatever you restand into a huge beater. This deck doesn't focus too much on flipping up a lot of G units, so this doesn't have as much use to me, but you might find use for it in your list as well if you need the option. Next, we're going to be taking a look at the grade 1s, and probably my other favorite card in the deck is Extreme Battler Gunbarugun. This card is just insanely flexible, because while it is a grade 1 and can be a booster in a pinch, he also can pull double duty and be a front row attacker as well. Using his skill turns him into a 13k for the rest of the turn, which can help us hit some magic numbers. And the main reason we use him as well and why he's so valuable is that he can restand himself. So that just interacts really well with some of our other pieces in the deck. We have other ways to kind of restand the restander through a kind of roundabout means within this deck, but Gunbarugun being able to do it by himself makes him incredibly valuable, especially because this deck is so focused on going first. Ganbado Gun's partner in crime, and probably the most important card in this deck is Extreme Battler Melyaki. This is the main rush skill that we're trying to ramp up during our main phase, because the more times the thing that is standing in front of Melyaki restands, the more instances of his red text the card gets, which just means that our board is going to get very, very big with each passing swing. That's the main reason I'm not running Sazanda in this list, because honestly Melyaki creates so much bigger boards compared to Sazanda. Now, that being said, the other fail con of this deck currently is missing Melyaki. Thankfully that doesn't happen too often, because that's why we're running it at max copies, but that's the other reason why I think there's probably the strongest argument for running Sazanda over Bare Knuckle Arnest, because at least that way we have a backup to where if we miss Melyaki, we may not miss Sazanda. But so far, this deck is performing well as it is with just this. You do have your brick moments, but that's any card game. Lastly, in our grade 1s, it's a lot of tech cards. We're running 2 copies of Extreme Battler Arashid, 2 copies of Extreme Battler Gunsden, 2 copies of Extreme Battler Jerohawk, and our single copy of Elementaria Sanctitude, because that's all we're allowed to run. We're running Arashid because it is important to get to Victor. Like I said, missing Victor is one of the fail cons of this deck, and if we're able to avoid that, if at all possible, by using Arashid, perfect. Gunsden is here to give most, if not all, of our board resist on our push turns, because it really, really sucks to be interrupted when you're swinging for the fences in this deck. And then lastly, we have Extreme Battler Jerohawk, just because it's more built-in redundancy for this deck, and being a back row restander can create some interesting board states that you wouldn't have otherwise had access to. He does cost a counterblast, which can be tricky, but there's plenty of plays that are worth spending your counterblast on Jerohawk specifically. Next, we're going to take a look at our triggers, starting off with the heals. We have 3 copies of Free Old Dragon, the Heal Guardian, and a single copy of Aragao Blauer Energy, the resource heals. I think you might see a lot of people running a split like this, unless they just really, really need the Heal Guardian or the grade of the card matters, just because now that these heals have been errated to be 10k power and 15k shield, makes them much more worth running. And particularly in this deck, can definitely raise the ceiling on some of our defensive plays. Next, we have our crits with 4 copies of the errated Extreme Battler Break Pass and a single copy of Magnagost 2502. The main reason for this is, 1, the errated crits are really, really good, and being able to function like a draw trigger on defense is great, so you will always get use out of that card, whether it's drive or damage check. And Magnagost 2502 is just another card that can go into Soul, which with this deck is pretty valuable, because we tend to have to really budget our Soul usage in this deck. We have several cards that use Soul over Counterblast, so being able to use that resource in as intelligent a way as possible is very, very necessary, and so having anything that can just increase that consistency is definitely valued. If you want to, you can definitely try and find room for something like Kitten Pickin', the stride crits. That can definitely help in some scenarios, but being that using the superior stride skill on the errated strides doesn't really work with cards like this, made me value it a bit less. You could also run things like Sarblau and Red Lightning, because these are 2 other cards that can go into Soul and also are able to give you some damage back, or in the case of Sarblau, you can unlock some cards as well, which, depending on how much you fear chaos, could be very valuable. That being said, I opted for the Magnagost just because it does give me that extra Soul, but it is also a 10k trigger. Next, we have our draws with 3 copies of Twin Blader, just because we gotta have ourselves some PGs. And then finally, we have 3 copies of Extreme Battler Kachiwal and our Overtrigger. Figure I'll just throw this in here, because really, what does it matter? You're going to be running an Overtrigger. That's just the way things are. Kachiwal, however, is potentially an interesting choice, and if you wanted to, you could definitely find an excuse to run Energy Girl over Kachiwal. I'm running Kachiwal just because it creates a higher ceiling for some of our plays when we're going second if our opponent is on grade 3. Just lets a interaction with Spiral Breaker play play out a bit more aggressively, which is definitely valued. And it also is just one of those cards, like I mentioned, it's the one that lets us restand the restander, if that makes sense. So you can use something like Cool Hank to target Kachiwal. Kachiwal restands, and then you restand that Cool Hank if that's what's in front of Melyaki. Otherwise, it's just there to be an extender and draw us cards. I guess you're going to need a starter too, and we've got Run Ball here just for the flavor. Now we'll take a look into the G deck. First, let's get this out of the way as well. We got Harmonix Messiah. If you don't have this, that's perfectly understandable. This card is ridiculous and was short printed to all hell. So if you're not like me and just kept on to a random vanilla card that hasn't been playable for the better part of a decade, that's perfectly fine. Getting into the real meat of the G deck now, we have 3 copies of Meteor Kaiser Vic 10. This is the main focus of the deck. This deck is focused on going first and going into this and having as good of a Vic 10 turn as possible. If things go your way, and honestly, sometimes even if you don't have quite the most optimal setup, you can either end your opponent on this turn if they have a really bad time, don't have Heal Guardians, and don't have any defensives. You can end your opponent on this turn, or alternatively, you can end up pushing them so hard that whatever they try to do back at you is so much less effective. You're easily able to survive it and then push them back even harder on the follow-up turn. I am running 3 copies because sometimes, depending on how the turn shakes out, you may run out of resources, you may run out of Counterblast especially, and may not have ways of getting it back. So being able to have like a third one of these just to at least still get some stands going for free is always rather welcome. Next, we have a single copy of Merciless Dragon, which in most cases is probably going to be your follow-up and finisher to Vic 10, provided you have the CB for it. Given that this deck uses very, very little CB in the main deck, you can definitely save it all for something like Merciless Dragon. And there are not very many decks that can stand up to 3 Vanguard swings, 4 depending on how much you just want to leave out there. And with the way our board constantly restands itself and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, one of these hits is going to come through and ideally probably close the game out for you. In case things don't go right and we have to deviate from the plan a little bit, we do have a single Asda bulk because restanding your front row is at least somewhat viable in the worst of situations. We have one of Universe Ace Bustard. This is very, very rare to be able to go into this, but it's better to have the option and have a suboptimal Bustard turn than a nothing turn, which has happened to me a couple of times. And by that same logic, we are also running a single copy of Winning Champ Victor, just because if for some reason our opponent decided to drop a Hanali and left it on the board instead of popping it for its skill for some reason, we have ways of getting around that. And sometimes just you really need the extra punching power. That's the thing with these slots right here. They're definitely flexible and just kind of depend on what you need for whatever fringe situations you anticipate yourself getting into. Lastly, for our strides, we have our finishers in a copy of Favorite Champ Victor and a copy of Fang Dragon King Fist Drigger. These don't get used very often, but it's another one of those cases of wanting to have it for those certain situations than not have them. I go into Favorite Champ Victor very, very little, but the times I have, it has been invaluable. And Drigger is just an absolute monster of a card, and depending on how you are able to build your board and structure your Drigger turn, can get very, very scary for your opponent. Lastly, we'll take a look at our G-Guards, which this is kind of the G-Guard lineup that I'm running in a lot of my Nova Grappler decks because I just feel the best with it. We have 2 copies of Extreme Battler Gundreed, 2 copies of Meteor Kaiser Dogen Titan, and 2 copies of Meteor Kaiser Stiff-Kneed. I'm personally on the double Stiff-Kneed train because with the way I've built this deck, there are definitely times and ways to go into both of them, and is one of the main reasons why I'm running the Blau heal for its countercharge ability, because it is very easy to have 2 heals in hand, go into a Stiff-Kneed, counterblast all your damage, draw your cards, then use the Blau heal to get a countercharge back, go into Gundreed, then flip up a Dogen Titan for that skill, skill, and then you've just gotten 2 CB back, and at the start of your next turn, you can use Dogen Titan to get a 3rd CB back. So you can get all of that back just with a couple of G guards. And this deck is also capable of going into double Gundreed and turboing. Turned Australian there for a second. And turboing our way to GB8. Not always a viable or smart option. In fact, I definitely lost at least one game I could have won by going into Drigger over Merciless Dragon, but hey, that's just why we playtest and learn these things. But this is just kind of my one-size-fits-all G Guardian lineup. If you want to make room for something like Dismal or something like that, you totally can. I'm not running Unior anymore just because the amount of situations where I end up in with no Counterblast and no Soul have gotten fewer and fewer. This has just kind of been the main thing. But if you want to find a way to get Dismal in there, you can. I just don't personally see too much of a use for that. Next, I just kind of want to highlight and showcase the main combo you should be aiming for. With the new going first rulings, you should always be trying to go first if at all possible. And in your opening hands, you're going to want to be seeing a Ganbarugun if at all possible, or at least any other restander, but ideally it's Ganbarugun in this case, and 1 or 2 other restanders. Obviously, I've left an entire column open here, which is just to show that the ceiling can go higher with this deck. And this is a pretty like average turn, I would say, because ideally you're able to do more than this, but at the bare minimum, this is what you should want to be aiming for. And honestly, it doesn't even need the Cosmo Lord here. Just that little setup right there alone can be good enough, but this is what we're aiming for on the high end. With these being the bare minimum of the pieces we want, ideally we'll also have something like a Arnest in hand, and we can use that Arnest to call him down, rest both of these, Soul Blast 1, and draw ourselves a card, which is already going to be very, very good. And then we can retire that Arnest to restand this Ganbarugun, which gets our Melyaki going right before we've even entered our battle phase. So we're already going to start making numbers. Whatever we drew, we can go ahead and just call to the board. It really doesn't matter, although you probably would want to hang on to that. That's just what I drew off the top there. And then you're going to use your Cosmo Lord to rest both of these, or anything else that you feel like calling to the board instead. It doesn't really matter, but in this case, trying to work with the bare minimum, or at least the average that we would have, we'll go for this. Then starting into the turn, how you're going to go about this is right away, you're going to start and you're going to swing here, and you're going to Soul Blast again to restand Ganbarugun himself. Now that is going to give us 2 restands already, and we've only done 1 attack so far this turn. And then you're going to start giving power plays. You can probably give it here and here. It really doesn't matter. Or you can start early by giving it on this Cosmo Lord here, but he'll have plenty of power as it is, so probably best to warm up your smaller guys first. Then you can just go ahead and swing with this again. You'll swing again here. Then at that point is when we'll swing with the Vanguard. We swing with the Vanguard, we Counterblast 1 to restand Ganbarugun, again, giving a 3rd proc of Melyaki here. And then with the on hit that goes off no matter what, we'll go ahead and restand this cool Hank. Doesn't really matter what our drive checks are. I didn't organize the deck, so we just healed a bunch of times. Ideally, you won't be hitting that because you don't want to lose all your damage. We'll just pretend that those are nothing. Then you go ahead and swing here. You've gotten 3 procs of Melyaki here, and you can start dumping power onto these 2 probably. Or maybe you want to start involving with 3 stands, you can probably give each of them a good dose of power at that point. You then swing with the cool Hank, you discard, you restand this again. We've got a 4th proc of Melyaki here. We swing here, and at this point is when we're going to drop all of the power on these 2 cards. Because for the final swing of this turn, this guy's going to be absolutely massive, and for our final CB, we'll restand him 1 more time. So on what is usually a fairly conservative turn, I would call, based on some of the turns I've had with this deck, we've gotten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe my math might be wrong there, but 9 attacks, and all of which got just bigger and bigger the more we restood and swung. There's also other ways to go about this too, because maybe if you're going second instead of having Ganbaru Gun, what you can do is you can actually call this here. And if you don't have Ganbaru Gun, ideally you will at least have a Spiral Breaker, and even better if you have a Kachi Wall here, because then you can start doing the same thing. Ideally you would have an Arnest to kind of get the restands going early on the Spiral Breaker here. You can use Cosmolord here to rest this column potentially, or you can just rest the back row and get a swing off of this first. But either way, you'll probably do this, and then the main thing is that you swing here with the boost, and then as long as your opponent's on grade 3, you can restand this column, which then procs the Kachi Wall to restand the Spiral Breaker, and then you've restood the restander, like I've said before. So that way you're just constantly getting a consistent amount of procs of Malyaki to make sure that your board is not going to be shut down by a defensive trigger or a Heal Guardian, and might take even both of those and more depending on how the stands go. Obviously the ceiling just gets higher and higher with this play the more restanders you have on a given turn, the more damage you have, things like that. That is the main combo you definitely want to be searching for. Hey, how's it going? Thanks for watching my video. Loki says hi too. Real quick before you take off, if you want to leave me a like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Maybe share it around because that intro took a lot longer than you might have expected to make. And chances are, if you've made it this far in the video and you're still here, you're probably the person I want to be talking to anyways. Let me know what you guys think of this new kind of like style. I've just been really wanting to change up how I do videos, make it more interesting and fun for me. Hopefully it has similar results for you. Don't expect the Toonami intros for every video I do though. That is exhausting. Also, I am commentating for Worlds here in at this point is in like 2 weeks. So if you see me and you want to say hey, feel free. I'll say hi to you. I got nothing going on. Well, I'll probably have a lot going on because I'm going to be in Japan for the first time, and that's really cool. Honestly, it's a dream come true to not only commentate for Worlds like I did last year, but this year even more so because I get to go to Japan, and that is all because I have you guys watching my videos and stuff. So it's gratitude is very important to me, and showing that is very important to me. So yeah, thank you guys. This has been cool. It's been a wild ride. But yeah, anyways, I'll start rambling if I don't get the hell out of here already. So yeah, take it easy, whatever.